welcome to a new episode of the Computomics Podcast. Our guest today is Louisa Burwood-Taylor, the Chief Communications and Intelligence Officer of AgFunder, a global venture capital investor with roots in agri-food, AI, biology, and climate. Welcome, Louisa.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's a true pleasure. We like to start a little bit out of left field in this podcast, and I was wondering, what was the last thing that inspired you?
Oh, interesting. I thought you were about to say what was the last thing I ate, which could actually be linked to what inspires me. Good food, good people, and good environments.
I love that. And you deal with all of that in your work. Maybe for those who don't know AgFunder, could you just give a quick blurb? What is the work you actually do?
Yeah, absolutely. So AgFunder is a global venture capital firm. As you mentioned in the intro, we invest in deep tech platforms that can unlock limiting factors in big industries, including agri-food, human health, planetary health, and so on. We were founded in 2013, and we were always on this mission to bring more investment and innovation into the agriculture and food sectors. And we knew in those days, no one really was thinking about investment in agriculture or food. So we knew that to educate people about the opportunity. And that's where we created AgFunder News. And that's where I come in as a journalist by background. I'd been covering agriculture investment already, and I joined AgFunder to build out the news site that they had already started and do research reports and so on. So we created an ecosystem, a subscriber base, a bit of a fan base, I think. And then in 2017, we went out to those people and we said, we're starting to raise venture funds. And so we started raising funds from then. And then fast forward to today, we have $300 million of assets under management. We have headquarters in San Francisco and offices in Singapore and London. We did an accelerator program out of Singapore for 5 years. And we've invested everywhere from farm to fork, across biotech, deep tech, robotics, AI, you name it.
Vast trove of experience that we can delve into in the short time that we have. One thing we were wondering about is, from your perspective, what influences, quote unquote, fundability of startups in food and agriculture?
It's been a really interesting journey since we first started investing. We've always been early stage investors. We're sort of slightly moving a bit more later stage now. In the early days, it was, it's always very much focused on the team. So is there a founder and a founding team that you can really get behind? Do they have the background, the expertise, the technological capabilities to do what they're saying they're going to be able to do? And also, do they have, decent business sense? Those things often don't come hand in hand. So that's always really important. Today as well, it's been a rough ride for agri-food tech over the past 10 years. A lot of that because it's been a nascent industry finding its way. It also was caught up in some of the venture capital hype era of around 2021, when there was record-breaking levels of venture capital investment. And some of the categories within agri-food tech certainly got caught along with that and then came crashing down. But it's also been a learning journey. You have entrepreneurs that discovered agriculture as a potential industry to deploy technology into, but perhaps didn't quite understand the nuances of this industry as well as they could have done, or as well as was necessary, perhaps more to the point. So I think we're now in this second wave or third wave, I don't know what to put it, where there's been a lot of ground truthing essentially done around the industry, how it works, where technologies could be useful, where perhaps they're less useful, or whether perhaps they don't fit a venture capital time frame, because that's another thing to think about, that venture capital is sort of typically your funds are 10 years. As an investor, you want to try and exit within 7, if not less. And how does that time frame match adoption and so on? And because of that, in this wave now, you're going to find investors being a lot more demanding around the adoption of technology. Where are the revenues? How is that looking? And actually, what is the path to profitability for these companies? Whereas in the heydays of 2021, it was sort of scale and growth at all costs and figure out the business model later. And I think one of the, the truths that have really come home to roost has been that we need to be able to see the business case, from the get-go pretty much.
How can a startup prepare for this kind of scrutiny, if you will? What's best practice in your experience?
They can be prepared for the scrutiny by having a decent business case. I mean, I feel like, you're not going to sort of angle it in a way that makes it look better than it is. It needs to be a feasible business. They need to make sure they have, really spoken with the customer and making sure that they're seeing a need for what they're doing. They need to make sure they have the technological chops behind them, and they need to have made sure they've, looked at what else is out there in the marketplace, and can they match up to or actually exceed the potential competitors who are out there. One of the companies that in our portfolio that's doing really well is called Verdant Robotics, and they've got a platform called the Sharpshooter platform, which essentially can apply herbicide on a precision basis. So they use AI and computer vision and so on to be able to detect where it's needed and apply that through the field. But Gabe, the founder, he spent at least a year just speaking to farmers before he even wrote a line of code. And I think that has been something that's really set them apart from some others who are fantastic technologists, but then have started building something for agriculture without really understanding what the need is. And exactly. And Verdant is consistently sold out of its robotics now. And I think that really comes from making sure that they're answering that need.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of getting at, because I get the sense sometimes that people have a great idea, or they have a certain, maybe a background from university, from research, but they don't really know how to go about testing or prototyping even. Before they even build the prototype, they have the idea, but prototyping to test whether they even have a case in the market. It might just be a nice theoretical idea. And that's, I feel like, especially for people who are coming from the research side, that can often be an issue.
And I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because I want people to come into this industry, and having worked in it for now nearly 15 years, I still get, surprised and disappointed at the relatively small scale of agri-food tech when you look at it compared to other venture capital sectors. This is the biggest employer in the world. It's one of the most important industries. As I said, it can inspire us 3 times a day. But so you don't want to put people coming into the sector, but it just is that bit more complex, because you're working with living systems, you're working with different weather patterns, you're working with different soil types, you're working with different crop types. So, it's much more complex and ever changing than other industries, and it cannot be tested upon with the same frequencies you can with consumer technologies, because you're growing X number of crops per year or X number of times per year. So yes, entrepreneurs need to make sure they've done enough of that ground truthing to be able to bring something to the market. But I also don't want to put them off coming and giving it a go. So there's some interesting platforms where you can partner with ag experts. You can do some stuff on the ground with people that can actually help you with sort of a bit of a soft landing. And I believe there's groups like Reservoir Farms, for example, that are doing that in California. And I think there's plenty of others. And there's also accelerator programs you can join and so on. So I think that would be a core bit of advice would be, if you have something that you think would be relevant for the sector, find that expert and find those places where you can go and do that prototyping or initial testing and so on. And don't sort of discount it straight away. But one of the things that we've, AgFunder, we've, been evolving our investment thesis over the years with our experience and what's worked and what hasn't and so on. And over the past fund or so, we've started investing more in multi-sector platforms which have applicability into agriculture, where we, oftentimes the entrepreneurs, as I mentioned, are not necessarily thinking of agriculture in the first instance, and maybe developing something for the energy space or the healthcare space and so on. But often there is applicability that can be brought into food and agriculture. And then what helps with that approach is that the technology can sometimes be de-risked for another sector, and then we can come in as an investor and help them to bring it into food and agriculture. So that's one of the reasons that we've kind of taken that approach. We want to invest in impactful, large-scale platforms. And so if they are being deployed into other industries too, that actually can support their success and their durability.
So I'd love to, if you can, give maybe an example or go into a little more detail how that works, like how you would go in or how you did go in, if you can give a concrete example.
Yes, exactly. So we've got a company in portfolio called Atenary. They are Swiss, well, they're also in San Francisco and Switzerland. And they have developed an AI platform that can help to accelerate experimentation for chemists. So essentially, it is a no-code platform that can help you to determine what should the next experiment be. And then now they are feeding that into robotics. So it's got a physical AI component, whereby you then have robotic laboratories that can undertake some of the experimentation, feed those results back into the algorithm, and then continue to iterate from there. And they have some unbelievable sort of timelines that they managed to compress through this technology. And they were actually created, if I think I have this right, where they were looking into new components for batteries, and they wanted to speed up that discovery process, and they essentially built this platform for that. But now, one of their bigger sectors is in pharmaceuticals, but then equally, we've made several introductions across the agri-food supply chain. So it could be with agriculture companies looking for new discoveries within the crop input space, or it could even be for food companies looking at new formulations and so on. So that's example how it it can work across, and they can essentially do that experimentation as a service, or they could even sell the technology to those organizations to use in-house.
You were the networking connecting factor?
No. They did have a couple of trials going with some food companies. Yes. But I mean, there's nothing to say that maybe, and that helped us to identify that they would be relevant for us. But, it could have been a case that maybe they hadn't yet had an ag or food customer and they hadn't yet thought of it. And we've certainly broadened their sort of thinking around food and ag.
I was just thinking with the way you're set up and the background with the educational side, that was kind of even part of the early stages of your development, that might maybe happen more often than not, where you have the connections, you have this bird's eye view, given the breadth of your investments, where you could actually say, hey, have you ever thought about this company? This sounds like something that might actually be a nice match.
Yes, exactly. And even, and if we're writing about them on AgFunder News or covering them on our social platforms, then customers would also find them that way too.
One thing that we've come across is the question of buy or build as a challenge for smaller companies. In your experience, how do startups or smaller enterprises especially deal with larger corporates who are challenging them with buy or build? So they see, for example, smaller company offers a service and they see like, I can see the point of that service, but why should I buy from you, or why should I pay you for that service? I can afford to hire a 20-person team, just build kind of something like that in-house and have it in-house. Is that something you've come across?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't worked in any of these big companies to assess when it works and when it doesn't, but you can anecdotally, you see when large corporates have pulled back on some of their internal building initiatives. A really interesting one recently is Bayer has decided to no longer pursue its internal ag biologics program. So they did actually buy, though, in the early days. They bought a biologicals platform. Gosh, I think it was back in like 2012 or something. And they have had their own biologicals department looking at creating, and for biologicals, I mean, bio alternatives to synthetic inputs. But apparently they're now choosing to just go purely with external partnerships on that. And I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, from what I know of working in large companies, things move a lot slower, can move a lot slower. And, adopting new technologies is not necessarily as rapid as elsewhere. And so that's what, that's kind of what the venture capital industry is built on, this premise that get extraordinary entrepreneurs, extraordinary people from outside who can create things in such a targeted and focused and rapid way, that in a way that the large corporations cannot do it internally. I mean, I don't know if that's a very good answer. I don't have a huge amount of experience with why they can't move faster internally, but anecdotally, it's just what you see.
I would actually see that as a sign of hope for small companies that are maybe, worried about that factor, where they say you're actually more relevant than you may think because you provide this very precise, very specialized service, and you just have to maybe be a little more confident in communicating that.
Right. You see in healthcare, it's a much more trodden and easier path for exit in healthcare. But essentially, health tech companies will make a discovery, do a human clinical trial, and once they've got the results from that human clinical trial that it works, it pretty much triggers an acquisition at that point. And that's a well-trodden path. The problem in food and ag is that you can do a field trial But then the large companies are going to say, okay, well, we need to do a few more of those trials because we need to try it in this type of soil, in this type of climate, this for this. It's so much more variable, like I mentioned at the beginning. But yes, I mean, there's definitely that route. And I think maybe that because there isn't that trigger point so clearly in ag tech for an acquisition, maybe that's why some of the corporates have continued to do things a lot more internally. And that kind of does make sense. An interesting example on the robotics side is John Deere has been quite acquisitive and has bought quite a few startups, including one of our own, Bear Flag Robotics. They made the initial acquisition of Blue River Technologies, which is the see and spray company. And that sort of became a bit of a foundation for its novel robotics and AI division internally. And then that team went on to acquire other companies to add on top. So it's a combination of buy and build, I suppose. But it's great because they've used these acquisitions as key kind of cornerstone moments in building out that internal department. And I think that seems to have worked very well.
Do you see a difference between, let's say, mergers and acquisitions in the quote unquote global north versus emerging markets in Asia, for example?
There haven't been many acquisitions in either market, but we haven't seen largish ones like the Blue River acquisition, for example, out of Asia. I wonder if the IPO market is going to be more of an exit route for some Asian ag tech companies. We have one in our portfolio that I think will be looking to do an IPO out of India in a year or so time, as opposed to an acquisition. But yeah, I'm racking my brains to think of an acquisition out of Asia. I can't really think of many, at least not scale.
Do you have any advice when it comes to an agri-food tech business who is maybe looking to sell into the emerging market? So that may or may not be more technically advanced or less technically advanced. So that the other side, basically selling into the emerging market. Do you see any trends within the industry from your perspective?
I mentioned biologicals. So I think a shift away from chemical farming is something that is slowly but surely, I hope, happening. And obviously there's movements like regenerative agriculture, which is giving this breathing room. But we also have geopolitical and macroeconomic reasons to shift away. And if you look at the recent war and the squeeze on supply of fertilizers and pesticides too, there has been an uptick in demand for alternatives. And I think given where technological capabilities are now, the efficacy of those are really improving and the discovery is accelerating using tools like Atenary or wherever it may be. So I think that is exciting. It felt like when I first started 12 years ago that the biologicals was something that may happen. You never knew when it was actually going to be a viable tool. Everyone was excited about it, but there was just so many intricate reasons why it would not work in this place and that place and delivering it and transportation and so on. So that's a big trend that's not going away at all. Robotics, continues to develop and excite. And again, that was very much a pipe dream in the early days of my coverage. And what you can do now in terms of physical AI, where the AI models are and how you can feed those into robotics to be continuously self-improving, like the likes of Verdon and Atenary and so on, that is super exciting. So that is certainly a continuing trend. On the newer front, say if you're looking a bit more downstream, I think the advent of GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic and so on are going to start to really shift the types of food that consumers are eating, and you're actually seeing that at the supermarket, the shopping basket, or however you want to describe it. What is being sold to individual consumers is changing. And oftentimes consumers are eating less, but they want to eat better food, high quality food. And this is an interesting time where you've got this confluence of all this AI and data that you can learn and discover more about the food that how it's grown and like the nutrient density of it and so on. So, a lot of people are trying to link food growing conditions to nutrient availability and to the sort of the healthfulness of that food. And I And then if you've got consumers that are then wanting to eat better food, and if they're really counting every calorie, or not counting every calorie, what do I mean? They want to get more out of each calorie because they're eating less. There's this interesting potential combination there of these two worlds where we could start to really learn a lot more about what we're eating and thinking about agriculture as being very much linked to human health.
Those are a few very interesting examples, and definitely a lot of reason to be optimistic and excited about the developments. And there may be more to come given the geopolitical developments currently. So maybe you can come back in a year or 2 years' time and we can look back and analyze those. Thank you so much, Louisa, for your time, for your insights. And to our audience out there, we'll put the links in the show notes. Thank you, Louisa.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening in today. Want to learn more? Then check out our show notes and more info on Computomics.com. If you have questions or want to propose a next guest, please reach out to us at podcast@Computomics.com.